Hi, welcome. Hi, Dr. Key and team. Great to see you.
Hi. And then
Hi. Hi, Dr. Prasad. If you wanted to participate, we have our chat up. We'll be get starting in just a few moments. If I know some of you are in the same room, but if you want to introduce yourself, maybe share an example of progress in gender equality, higher education that is worth celebrating at your school or a school that you affiliated with, or something you've seen in your own experience, you're welcome to do so. And our speakers are as well.
Yeah. Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
hello.
Yeah?
Hello.
Oh, Dan, I think Dr. Key's talking to you.
Hi, Dan. Hello.
All right, we just have a few more people. We have a great group coming in.
Hi, Maddie.
Hi, great to see you.
Hi. Hi. Hello, it's me, Safili. Hello, Safili, Wango Dynamics Technology.
Hi. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to get started. I'm just gonna change here. All right, so everybody, welcome. It's great to have familiar faces. It's great to have new faces. It's great to see everyone. Some people in one room, some people in their own rooms, which is fantastic. We're happy that you're all here. Welcome to the Global Gender Equality and Higher Education Workshop in collaboration with CIPE and PNG-Aus Partnership. I probably said that wrong, and Jane will correct me in just a few moments. But before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you are not speaking, to please mute yourselves. You don't have to have your camera on. We would love to see you. We love to see participants, especially if they speak. I know a few of you have submitted questions in advance, but please, please, please feel free to use the chat. We want to see your questions. We want to see your comments. And so today's agenda tonight, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are, we will be beginning with a welcome message, and we will go through some introductory remarks, a wonderful keynote, and then we will jump right into the panel, which will be followed by closing remarks. So at this time, I would like to introduce from CIPE, our partner, Jane Kim, who's the Senior Program Officer at the Asia and the Pacific at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Jane, that is quite the title. So if you want to start, we would love to hear a few words from you.
Sure, thanks, Maddie. Hi, everyone. As introduced, I'm Jane Kim. I'm a Senior Program Officer on the Asia and the Pacific team at the Center for International Private Enterprise. We also go by CIPE. And I manage our portfolios in the Pacific Islands as well as the Korean Peninsula. Just to give a quick introduction to CIPE as we get started, for the benefit of those who are meeting us for the first time, CIPE is a nonprofit affiliate of the U.S. Chamber, and we occupy a very niche space within the development community. Our mission is to strengthen democracy through private enterprise and market-oriented reform, given the unique opportunities that the private sector has to uphold democratic values and institutions. Our work focuses on business advocacy, democratic governance, anti-corruption and ethics, as well as enterprise ecosystems. At CIPE, we see entrepreneurship as a great vehicle for economic inclusion globally. In PNG, Papua New Guinea, where we've been active since 2013, the largest portion of our work, supported by the PNG-Aus Partnership, has focused on strengthening the entrepreneurial ecosystem for women in business by supporting various institutions that can train and provide resources for businesswomen. In addition to our flagship program known as the PNG Women's Business Resource Center, feel free to look that up on Facebook, we operate. It's a physical, safe physical space that functions as an information and resource hub, holistically serving the needs of aspiring and established women entrepreneurs. Our 4 university partners of the PNG University Entrepreneurship Consortium have been a key pillar of our overall work. Since 2015, we've partnered with business schools in Papua New Guinea to ensure that formal entrepreneurship training is firstly available, but also that it takes into consideration gender-sensitive pedagogy and pathways for women to thrive as entrepreneurs. After supporting their curriculum building, we discussed at length with our university partners ways in which they can continue to build the entrepreneurial ecosystem on their university campuses. So it seemed really fortuitous that CIPE reconnected with GBSN at that particular moment. Through our partnership, GBSN has brought from member schools global best practices on topics of interest to our PNG business school partners. After 2 years of virtual workshops with GBSN, we are pleased to share that I will be joined by 2 faculty members from both Pacific Adventist University and IBS University, who are in attendance today, at the GBSN Beyond Conference next month, not only to meet with Dan and Maddie finally in person, but hopefully many of you as well. Today's workshop is a true reflection of, I think, our partnership progression with not only our business school partners in Papua New Guinea, but also with GBSN, to think about the intersection of entrepreneurship education and inclusivity. We're pleased to be able to collaborate on this workshop to not only benefit our PNG partners, but also members of the GBSN network. So in closing, I'd like to thank all of our speakers who are joining us today from various parts of the world for sharing your insights and knowledge. Thank you to GBSN for coordinating this wonderful event today. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are attending, especially, of course, our PAU and IBSU partners. So I look forward to the engaging conversations ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And we are so lucky to have been partnered with you for the past 2 years. It's been an absolutely amazing and enriching experience. At this time, I am very, very excited to introduce not only the senior advisor to GBSN, but the former head of DEI initiatives at the accrediting body at AACSB, which I know a few of you are very familiar with. We have Julianne Inarelli. So Julianne, I am passing it over to you.
Thank you, Maddie, and thanks again, Jane, for that kind of introduction of the GBSN and CIPE partnership. I'm really excited to be able to help introduce today's discussion about the role that higher education can play in addressing gender inequality, and also the role that both can play in cultivating a thriving and inclusive entrepreneurial economy. I'm sure you're all familiar with goal number 5 of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, which is the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And you'll know that gender equality is also integral across the other sustainable development goals. For our purposes today, it's worth noting specifically the intersection with goal number 4 of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. And yet, in addition to those 2 goals, there are gender-specific benchmarks tied to another 9 of the 17 goals. And many of these, such as poverty, hunger, health, affordable energy, and goals related to decent work and economic growth, as well as those related to sustainable cities and communities, address together and holistically the barriers to women's fuller participation in higher education and the impact that can be seen from that. So it's entirely expected that with so many touch points across the goals, this is a complex issue. And that means that those of us gathered here today will come with many different lenses on this topic, both through our own personal experiences and our work and our interests. And we'll orient our discussion today through 3 very broad lenses, those of accessibility, efficacy, and impact. And I'll take just a few moments to help set the stage for that discussion by touching on each of those at a high level, knowing fully that our panelists will bring forward much more nuanced and detailed angles for us to consider. So first on accessibility, maybe you're aware that since the early 1990s, the enrollment of women in higher ed globally has been increasing at a faster rate than that of men, and that in many places the number of women has eclipsed the number of men enrolled. Maybe that said, you're all too familiar with the nuances behind that statistic, that there are countries that are exceptions to that general trend, that there are methodological challenges and limitations related to what's tracked, including participation at non-traditional ages and how individuals progress through higher and higher levels of education. Perhaps you're sitting there thinking, well, gender parity is also not having the current 88 men for every 100 women pursuing tertiary education, as documented in a recent UNESCO report on boys' disengagement in education. And maybe your lens is even more granular, focusing beyond the success of those many women who are now accessing higher education, but rather focusing on the remaining challenge of the so very many who are still not participating. What are their barriers? What do they lack? What is needed to ensure their fuller participation in higher education? And maybe your focus is more oriented to business and entrepreneurship, on access to those specific kinds of opportunities, both degree-based and in lifelong education, that open doors for women to pursue careers as leaders in businesses and their local economies. You'll know that countless studies have tracked changes in women's participation in and progression in a variety of firms. As just one example, a recent Grant Thornton longitudinal study finds that among mid-market companies around the globe, there's been incremental and steady growth in the proportion of senior management positions held by women, peaking last year at 31%. But yet again, like with the education trends, these are nuanced and highly divergent across regions and industry sectors. And there are complications, as many of you have seen and experienced recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. In low and middle income countries, 17% of women are entrepreneurs and 35% aspire to become entrepreneurs, according to a report last year from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Globally, women represent 1 in 3 growth-oriented entrepreneurs and also 1 in 3 established business owners. What are the kinds of educational opportunities that have contributed to their success? What will help sustain their success? And what's needed to help other women, especially those in those still underrepresented segments, to follow? And what are the ways that higher education institutions can use their influence to reduce other barriers outside of educational access, like access to wealth and finance, that results, for example, in the finding by the UN Council for Trade and Development that in the least developed countries, women are 4 times less likely than men to be sole proprietors of the businesses in which they are owners. So second, today we'll talk about efficacy. And in pursuit of our shared goal, we'll explore some examples of biases unintentionally ingrained into our ways of thinking and doing. Examples of how some of the narrowly framed or outdated notions of gender roles, interests, and capabilities are reflected in our processes and language. We'll explore how some of the materials we lean on for instruction might send implicit or unintended signals about the opportunities and possibilities. A study by the Case for Women, for example, looked at 135 award-winning and best-selling case papers available through a major case bank, and found that only 45% included a woman in any role pertinent to the case, and that just over 1 in 10 featured a woman as a protagonist of the case. That's just one example, but we'll also explore whether it matters who is in front of the classroom or who is framing the research questions and analyzing the research findings that ultimately find their way into instruction. While students in many parts of the world in primary and secondary education experience an overrepresentation of women in teaching roles, once they move to tertiary education, that shifts and women are suddenly underrepresented at the front of the classroom. More narrowly, just 30% of the world's researchers at universities are women, ranging from a regional low of 23% in South and West Asia to 45% in Latin America and 48% in Central Asia. Last, we'll explore points of view on what's needed for ultimate impact in order for those benefits of the educational access and experience to stick throughout women's careers. And what are the potential for all participants, both men and women, instructors and students, business leaders, entrepreneurs, employees, customers, and communities to be changed for the better as a result of focusing on gender equality in higher education? How are they more empowered individually? And how are they better equipped or not to be advocates for and enablers of more equal opportunities between men and women? And how will our world and our ways of working change, not only when certain leadership roles like chief financial or information officers, become more represented by women, but also when the opposite shift takes place, when roles like HR directors or primary education educators become less dominated by women and thus more represented by men. These are macro challenges and goals, and our speakers today are united by a common focus on the benefits of gender equality in higher education. And we can look forward to them connecting the dots to a much more micro and nuanced experiences and understanding, and also actions. So whatever your lens and whatever your interests, I hope you find some nuggets of wisdom, some kernels of ideas, and some sparks of inspiration for continuing that hard work you're doing of pursuing gender equality in higher education and through higher education. Higher education alone can't solve all of our challenges, but there are certainly things we can do that will directly impact and shape the system in positive ways over the medium and the long term. And to begin exploring what those things are, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to our keynote speaker for today, Connie Gonzalez, Deputy Director of the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment based in El Salvador. Connie, thank you for being here today.
Great, thank you so much, Julianne. Appreciate your comments and your opening. Also, thank you for the invitation to speak. And I mean, even really more excited about the panel discussion afterwards. It's so fantastic to see women from so many parts of the world coming together for an event, and that's one of the favorite things about my job right now is being part of these types of networking opportunities and sharing common goals. Maybe perhaps in terms of introduction and to reflect just a little bit on, Julianne, on what you just said about everybody here is coming with a different perspective. As you were speaking, my mind just started racing and kind of going through all the experiences I've had and how I guess where I am today is such a combination of those experiences. I've worked at a business school in Central America. I've worked with the US government in kind of more of a donor role. I'm now working, well, I also previously worked in more of an academic space and an NGO space, and now working with CIPE, where we're focused on bringing the private sector into dialogue and these conversations that are happening around gender equality. So I think my perspective today is one of women's leadership and how key that is to advancing some of these common goals that we have. The topic of gender equality in companies. And so also thinking about this bridge between higher education, whether it's to business schools or whether it's directly into the workforce. And then, you know, as well, looking at the barriers to entrepreneurship, whether it's, you know, people who are entering the workforce and then leaving to start their businesses or have started their businesses and then enter the workforce. I think that just to put a framework on it, that's my perspective and where I am today. So I wanted to share, I have a presentation just so people have something to look at besides my face. And let me put that up. And really with this, I just like to offer, you know, some context and maybe frame some questions to get everybody thinking. I'm not here with answers. I'm just here with some perspective and perhaps some questions for you to come up with the answers. So let's see, there we go. I think there are many studies and different demonstrations of how when you have more women in leadership positions, there's positive benefits from that. In terms of, you know, how companies perform, in thinking about how teams perform, in thinking about decision making and management, in thinking about other issues such as corruption, participation. And so, across the board and in many different ways, different metrics out there can be used to try to measure how companies perform, how countries perform, how businesses perform when there's women in leadership positions. And not just women, but also thinking more broadly, as you mentioned, Julianne, about diversity in a more inclusive sense of it, and thinking about people who have other intersectional identities, women of color, for instance, or people with disabilities, and how the inclusion of those perspectives can really lead to high quality, high performing teams, and can also lead to great successes, whether they're business successes or elsewhere. So I think this is a good reflection for both kind of the world out there, like after school, but also, you know, as we're thinking about our own organizations, what does our own school look like? Our leadership team within our business school or higher education institute. You know, what does our face look like? Who is in the management positions? Who's making the decisions for us? Who's helping decide those cases that are being taught? Who's writing those cases for us? And so thinking that through and recognizing that the more diversity and different perspectives we can include, the richer curriculum that we'll have, the richer the experiences, and a better reflection of what the world should be, right? In terms of everybody else who's out there. The second thing that I'd like to note is that women are very good at leading. So while traditionally in business schools, for instance, women perhaps were taught, okay, in order to be a good leader, you have to lead like a man. The research now, especially those who focus on studying leadership, have identified traits that make a good leader. And then they've studied, you know, how men and women tend to lead. And women tend to exhibit characteristics that align with those of good leaders. Things like they're very self-aware and they understand where they are, where they want to be, which can lead to increased preparation and therefore higher performance. The fact that women are more in tune to people, the empathy, the emotional intelligence, the communication, the fact that women tend to be more humble, and that's a very desirable leadership quality in terms of thinking about others, thinking about the team, thinking about the company, thinking about how we are operating, and using that data and that information in order to make changes about how they're managing and how they're leading, and very much thinking about others in terms of lifting others up. I think we recognize the importance of mentoring, of coaching, of having a sponsor, whether it's in a formal setting or an informal setting. And so the possibility that women have to envelop that role and lead. So more and more we're realizing that women, you know, generally possess qualities of good leaders. There's also a lot of studies and data that show that women outperform men. So while men are usually the ones who are promoted, women actually perform better. And so thinking about examples that have been studied in the past 2-3 years under COVID, that both countries and companies that were led by women fared better during the pandemic in different metrics that would measure that type of performance. And so recognizing the importance of having women in leadership positions, recognizing the strengths that women bring when they are in leadership positions. And then what I would ask everyone here to reflect on is when you're thinking about what you're teaching at your institution, you know, how are you teaching leadership? And what is the message that you're sending both to the men in the classroom and the women in the classroom? Because again, it's not just about providing spaces to women, but it's also sharing the information and the data that exists so that men can be part of this gender equality push and gender equality movement that needs to happen. one final thing that I'd like to share, and this is just because I found it fascinating when I was first introduced to it. This was from, I've participated in several women's leadership programs, and this one was from Wharton Executive Education. And this was a study that was done in companies. So once women and men are hitting the workforce, that men receive more critical assignments. Those are key for promotion, for moving up, for becoming tracked for a leadership position. That generally when assignments were given, men had 2 times the budget and 3 times the staff than those assignments that were given to women. That men were more likely to be provided or have an opportunity to link to mentors and sponsors in the organization from someone more senior. And we know how important networking is to move up and to move out and to build your networks in terms of thinking, in more in the entrepreneurial space. So much of success is like your networks, who's in your network and who do you know, in order to access resources, access finance, access, business contacts, access customers, et cetera. And then, the biases that we all deal with in terms of those that are conscious and subconscious, unconscious, excuse me, in terms of race and gender and other factors. And so thinking about, if that's the situation in the workforce, how are we as a higher education institution providing a platform so that we're giving the most opportunities that we can and helping raise up our students and our, the people, the men and women who are graduating from our institutions, so that they go into a workforce and they can help change these structural biases, these structural frameworks that exist. So what I would suggest and what I would ask is, what classes are being taught? What topics are you teaching? And how can you prepare your students better for that framework of a world, in thinking about incorporating new and different information in the curriculum? And in those classes, what information is being taught? Is it the same case study from, 1978? And I know professors who do that. Is it the same case study from before? Is that still relevant in our time? Is that showing and demonstrating, like you mentioned, Julian, is that demonstrating women in leadership positions, women in decision-making positions, and how those decision-making processes might differ with a more gender equitable space? And, thinking about the needs and challenges that men and women have in the entrepreneurial ecosystem specifically. Because while there are some that are common, such as access to finance, that's a common challenge for people who want to start up a business. There are other challenges and barriers that are different for men and women. There's legal barriers that prohibit women from doing things in certain countries. There's these network barriers of women tend not to be as connected. And so just reflecting on the fact that men and women do have some differences in terms of what their needs are as they're graduating, as they're entering either into, starting up their own venture or going on to graduate school or entering the workforce. The challenges and the frameworks that they're facing are different. And so thinking through clearly about, what are we doing in order to prepare our leaders? And what are we doing to help ensure that gender equality is front and center of how we prepare our leaders? So that's what I would put in front of us today. I'm very excited about the panel discussion that will follow and hearing some specific examples. I'd also be happy to share some other specific examples that I have picked up along the way as well. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I will pass it back to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Connie. Let me just keep him here. And I am at this time very, very excited to introduce our panelists, which will be led by our CEO, Dan LeClaire. I am going to go through a brief introduction of everybody. Of course, I simply cannot do justice to all of our speakers because they have so much incredible background and knowledge and wisdom that you won't get just a little taste of today. So at this time, as Connie has already spoken, we have Connie Gonzalez, Deputy Director at the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. A little bit about Connie. She leads the Women and Girls Empowered Management Consortium and the National Endowment for Democracy's 2021 grant promoting women leaders globally in economic recovery at CIPE, I believe is the right way you pronounce it. Excellent. And again, none of these are in any particular order. I have Professor Kathy Corman-Frey, Managing Director for the Center of Entrepreneurial Excellence at the George Washington University School of Business. Just a tiny bit about her. Kathy helped develop and currently teaches women's entrepreneurial leadership at GWSB. This program is the winner of the USASB Excellence in Entrepreneurship Education Award. She is also the founder of the EdTech social venture, the Hot Mamas Project, the world's largest women's case study library, providing access to diverse, teachable, scalable role models and mentors from around the world. In continuation, and I do apologize, let's see here, we have Dr. Yvette Mucherez-Icano, Professor of the Personal Management Area at Apate Business School. Yvette is a member of the International Coaching Federation and the Association for Talent Development 2013, as well as a member of the Board of Directors of the Research Center for Women in Senior Management. Followed by Dr. Nicole Sutton, Senior Lecturer of Accounting at the University of Technology in Sydney. Nicole is one of the founding members of the UTS Aging Research Collaborative and the lead author of the biannual Australia's Aged Care Sector Report. She's also currently co-host of the first 2 seasons of the podcast, Think Business Future. We then have Professor Neha Agarwal, Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Otago. Neha finished her PhD in 2018 from the University of California, Riverside. Her research interests are broadly in the field of development economics with a focus on topics such as labor, health, and gender issues. And I did read a little bit of your work, Neha. I'm very, very impressed. And then last but not least, and we're very excited to welcome Professor soon to be Dr. Mahreen Mahmood, originally from Brock University, now studying at Purdue in the US, so she's on our time zone. Maureen has completed a TOT on National Export Strategy Trainers for She Trades Commonwealth Project led by TFO Canada and implemented in Bangladesh with SME Foundation. She's currently pursuing her PhD at Purdue University College of Education. With all that being said, I would like to invite Dan to the floor as our Dr. Dan LeClaire, as our CEO and as our moderator for this panel, and I'm going to pin our panels and we can get started.
Well, thank you so much, Maddie, and thank you, Ms. Anarelli and Ms. Gonzalez for a wonderful introduction and welcome to this event. In fact, I feel like we've already had a full session just with the ideas and the content that you've shared. But we've just gotten started because now my job is to help 6 wonderful panelists share their experience and knowledge with all of us. And I mean that the experiences, I think, will be just as important as the knowledge. And I encourage all of our panelists to share, the kinds of things that they've seen and experienced throughout their careers. Julianne was kind enough to give us the structure, which I will apply through the discussion. We're going to try to talk about this topic, the topic of the role of higher education and addressing gender inequality in sort of 3 phases. We're going to talk about access. We're going to talk about efficacy, and we're going to talk about impact, as in the way Julianne described it. So without further pause, because we have a great panel, which also happens to be fairly large. We want to get started right away in sharing. I'm going to start with Dr. Agarwal. I'm going to start with you. And the reason why is because when we started talking about this with many of the panelists, Dr. Agarwal, you went right to the evidence, right? So I think it was one of the first words you used. And I wonder if you could share with us some of the things that you've learned about the evidence regarding access to education. I think, for example, you mentioned transportation and a unique program about mobility in education. Please start us off, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. And it's interesting you said evidence because so I finished my PhD in 2018, and the entire focus that my advisors and my course placed was on, how do you get a causal evidence? So did this policy actually change the outcome? So that has been really the focus of my training, and which is why I just picked up examples from the literature, which were about where you saw evidence, like causal evidence. And so I'll pick up examples from mostly developing countries, but a couple of examples from developed countries too, because some of the policies are just so interesting there. So like, I'm from India, I grew up there. And in India, you see that there is basically no gender gap now in primary school enrollment, because we have just had so many primary schools throughout the country. There was a big focus, but you start to see a major drop at secondary schooling. So when you go from primary to secondary, and people have been trying to figure out why is that drop happening. And the one thing that comes up is the transportation issue, like because a school is too far, because there are just fewer secondary schools, what can you do to make, distance shorter, or how can you transport the kid or the girl? And this is very important, especially in settings where culture of purity of girls becomes really central to how you raise the female child versus a male child. And that's where there's one interesting example, which I want to share is, so in India, in a I would say big state, Bihar, the government came up with a cycling program. They would give free bicycles, which are really cheap to every household. So the girl can ride the bicycle to school. And it was a very small intervention, but that really spiked up the secondary school enrollment in the villages that were given the bicycle, as compared to villages where there was no bicycle given. So we see, like, just by decreasing the cost through very simple measures, you can increase the enrollment. And that's the first step. If you're not able to push up the enrollment from primary to secondary, is just going to be a leaky pipeline all through the way. So that's one example about transportation. And a similar policy has also been tested in Zambia, where again, you see that providing something as simple as a bicycle can increase the enrollment. And the other policy where there is some evidence is, I want to talk about puberty. So once again, like, you see a big drop when girls reach puberty, and when schools do not have sex-specific washrooms or latrines. That's been a big issue, like school sanitation infrastructure. And so there are two things there. One is just providing the infrastructure of a well-functioning gender-specific restroom, so where girls can go. And the other thing is providing them sanitation products. So in India, again, there was a program where the government provided sanitary napkins for free, or for a very, very small cost, just so it's not being thrown away. And you see that providing something as simple, just catering to the health needs of girls at that age of 12 to 15, pushes up the enrollment a lot. And not just their enrollment, people have studied secondary outcomes like test scores and all, but the first order effect is just getting them to school. And that's by making the distance shorter and by making their basically lives a bit easier by just giving something as simple as health product or sanitary products. So those are the two main, and please feel free to stop me if I'm going over time. I have a couple of other examples, but please feel free to stop me.
We'll come back to you, Dr.
Sure.
Agarwal. I'm sure throughout this discussion, we'll try to weave these things together in a meaningful way. But I appreciate that start very much, because I think even in the introduction, Ms. Inarelli talked a little bit about how the connections between the SDGs and and I think your emphasis on how, simple interventions could really make a pretty big difference is a good way to start this. So I want to actually go to Professor Frey. I want to talk to you because in some of our exchange before this session, you were really emphasizing role modeling, and I suppose we'll talk about this throughout the remainder of this discussion, not just in terms of access, but tell us a little bit about role modeling in the context of access. I'm not sure you were connecting this particular example to the role modeling, but you cited an example about medical students in Pakistan, and maybe you could mention that, even if it's a little unconnected to what your initial point is.
Okay. Well, I definitely got everybody's interest with that. Putting that as a bullet point, it's like, what's the medical students in Pakistan bullet point? So first of all, thanks everybody for inviting me. It's so fascinating hearing everybody's perspectives. And this is just one of those game-changing events. And Maddie, thank you so much for putting it together. You're just a pro. We all see her working behind the scenes, doing the magic. So thank you very much. And I'll get through as clearly as I can. I actually have COVID now, and I can't even blame it on my son's poker game because that's how we got it. That's how the whole family got it last time. He's up at school. So role modeling, mentors, self-efficacy. This is the underpinning of the Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership class at the George Washington University School of Business. All roads come back to self-efficacy. And role modeling and access to mentors is in a sort of equation that we put together. It's a bit of a rehash, if you will, of some of Bandura's principles of self-efficacy. And so in the short and sweet equation that we put together, access to role models and mentors is a full half of the self-confidence equation. And so we teach the students that, and we assign a project, a very specific and structured project about mentors and role models, where they actually have to go out and create those connections, interview the mentors and role models, do an interactive project with them, and report back on it. This is tougher than you would think. For some students, even though GW is a major university, one thing I've noticed, and you all may have too over the years, is increasing amounts of almost social anxiety that seems to correlate with the advent of technology. They're just, dying to text them or message them or email them and not have to go out and connect with them. And so we really don't lose sight of the old school connections with people and to develop those connections. Additionally, the reason they have to go out and seek out their own mentors and role models is because research shows us that those who seek out role models, meaning they don't arrive to you, assigned to you in class or at a company, but you're seeking them out, those people move up higher in organizations and are paid more. So to us, that's just a proxy for, successful behaviors. And one of the things that we've done in women's entrepreneurial leadership, where we're sort of connecting some of the areas, is we actually have a mentorship program with a school in Tanzania. And the program manager there will say, this is what I'd like to hear from your students. This would be helpful to the girls, whether it's studying for tests, because the tests in Tanzania are very stringent, how to connect their ideas about wanting to be a doctor or a scientist to the real world, how they could find grants, how they could find connections in those areas. So to have young people mentoring other young people from other sides of the world, is really fun, and a digital classroom that they installed in Tanzania in 2019 is what allowed us to do that. The Pakistani medical students is an interesting example, and you can hear, I love hearing Dr. Agarwal talk about moving up through primary and then secondary, and we're always wondering what's the drop-off point going to be. So in Pakistan, I started working with a women's, it was actually an association of doctors based in the US, and they were bringing over some folks from Pakistan for a conference. And they said that there's an incredible amount of women who actually finish medical school, but because of societal norms, then they don't practice. So we're getting all the way up through medical school, right? Which is just astounding. And at the conference, they were talking about different interventions, right? It's what's their version of the bike. And for instance, telemedicine. What possibilities are there for them to keep practicing, not completely abandon their values or clash with societal norms in a way that's disruptive to their life and their career, but to be able to keep pursuing it. And so this was on the table for this medical association. And we were just really surprised, actually, to learn how many women were going all the way through medical school in Pakistan and then just stopped practicing.
That's very interesting. You brought up so much within that brief response, you know, the role of technology in helping us to address some of these questions, but also this, you know, perhaps a larger set of questions we always struggle with is the idea to change the system in some way or to succeed in the existing system, both obviously, I think, but those kinds of questions are pretty important. I want to, there's just so much opportunity here. I want to keep things going pretty quickly and turn to Dr. Machares. Machares, where are you? I'm going to make sure I got you there.
Yes, I'm right here, Dan. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it's nice to see you again. And I want to, and I apologize for picking on specific words for each of you, but in some of our initial dialogue, you talked about feminine school desertion, and I think I know what that means, but I'm trying to connect the dots with some of the things Dr. Agarwal said and Professor Frey said, in the sense of, you know, how do we think about access to education? Should we be thinking about women-only schools more today rather than less today? I think that's what you referred to when you talked about feminine school desertion, but correct me if I'm wrong, please.
Well, actually, I would like to tell you about, I mean, I'm located in Mexico City, although I travel around the country a lot. And I am also in charge of the Women in Senior Management Research Center. And we have been producing specific research on all these topics in order to be able to understand and decide better what's going on, regarding what's going on. And yes, actually we have observed that during the pandemic, there was a lot of school desertion, especially for girls and young women. The statistics for those women who are not actually in the labor force, but they're also not in school or receiving training, it was 28% during the pandemic, which is very high. And it was when we observed how it has evolved in time, it was actually the peak that we have seen over the past at least 15 years. And one of the things that we see is that we have an opportunity as a country to strengthen the caring system, because many of these girls and women and young women are dedicating their time to provide care for others. For example, in terms of if they have children at home or someone who's sick, or even doing household chores, instead of developing their talents and skills in these very important years. And unfortunately, this is added to this educational backlog that we already had before the pandemic in terms of, for example, educational attainment, or even in the tests that are a way of comparing different countries. Mexico, unfortunately, is delayed in this sense. So I truly recognize that the first step is to have the information. So this was why we decided to take this initial step to actually gather the information to understand what's going on. And then we have started a discussion between different, even universities. We have now a network of different universities in the country, addressing not only school desertion, but up to the levels of what's happening with participation in boards. For example, in Mexico, it's only 10% of board members are women. So we have been working in creating this network to first diagnose what's happening, and from there to take some actions in relation to this.
That's great, Dr. Bacharz. I remember learning about your initiatives related to women on boards and how important the technology had become for that. But also you talked about networking, or the network of schools, and working together to try to address these problems, because I think that's one of the challenges that we face, is that sometimes we try to tackle really big problems as a single institution rather than as a network or group of institutions. Thank you very much for that. I want to now talk a little bit about entry requirements. I want to go to Dr. Sutton. Dr. Sutton, you pointed to a lot of things, right, including some things that were already mentioned in terms of reaching out and encouraging women to go to university. But you specifically mentioned flexible entry requirements. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that. And then I want to turn to Professor Mamoon and talk with you also about that.
Sure, thanks, Dan, and thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I think, yeah, I'm really enjoying all the diversity of different perspectives on this kind of multifaceted issue. I really appreciated the metaphor that Dr. Agarwal mentioned about the leaky pipe and seeing the leaky and thinking about the different leaks that may exist along a very long pipe. I guess the leak that I was thinking about when thinking about access is in terms of, yeah, the entry into university, into higher education. And we know, you know, in Australia where I'm based, that there's a very high, your level of tertiary education has a very strong relationship to the level of tertiary education of your parents. Much more, despite, you know, the ideas of kind of, you know, the lucky country and merit, Australia actually rates quite low in terms of education mobility. And so in one sense, part of the reason that those issues exist is when you have very strict entry requirements that appear to be very merit based on merit, like, you know, your high school finishing scores and so on. But because of that, they tend to magnify privileges that exist earlier in the pipeline. And so one of the elements that different universities in Australia have now been experimenting with, then perhaps even more so because of COVID, which really throughout the whole, you know, high school exit exam situations of the last 2 years, we've seen an acceleration of different sorts of flexible entry modes into university to overcome different inequalities that exist. And so I think one of the examples that I think has been particularly effective at the university that I'm at UTS in Sydney is something that's it's called a U at Uni Academy, and it's an outreach program
where it's not just about changing a score after a high school exam, it's actually about reaching further into that pipe. So in terms of targeting and engaging with different schools that exist in different areas where where people don't necessarily go to high school very often, and having a series of on-campus programs by which students from those schools actually start coming onto campus, at least 2 years before the end of high school. And if they complete a program of activities, then that kind of qualifies for a much more flexible entry. And I think that serves one thing. It again gets around the very strict, this is your score. But it also, I think, speaks to something else, which is about overcoming maybe the psychological barrier that exists around higher education, being able to imagine going to university. It's particularly if your parents or if none of your family members have, even just being able to imagine what it's like getting on the train, going to the university, that transport again, and actually attending on campus, so that the mental and psychological barrier about thinking that this might be a place that you might fit is overcome well in advance before you actually might turn up once you've qualified.
Yeah, thanks for getting us started with that discussion about entry and admissions. And I want to turn to a different context then with Professor Mamoon. I know you're at Purdue now, but your experience has been very helpful in our work in Papua New Guinea. And Professor Mamoon, you talked about admissions, but also in the context of other variables, like whether it's public or private, or whether it's urban and rural. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see this potential for us to address access in those different contexts?
Yes, thank you, Dan. Thank you for inviting, and amazed and hi to my beautiful colleagues from Papua New Guinea, who we have met last year. And I think my internet started acting right when you called on me. So that's, you would wonder why this would happen in USA, but it still does. It looks like that it does. So yes, for access to education, and especially to higher education, we have seen a lot of surge in female inclusion. However, if we see the flexibility of the type of exams or the entry-level tests that both of these men and women all have to take part in, to some extent, it does have the evolution or anatomical inequality that exists, and it sometimes we do not even notice that this happens. So let me give an example of one of our recruitment exams that we take. So if you would take 20 MCQ tests and not ask any subjective tests of a personal story of somebody who has had the journey of coming this far, you would not be able to judge somebody's wanting to pursue that education despite everything that person have gone through. Sometimes if you see the motivation of somebody who's trying to get into education, I'm a big believer of second chances. I have had second chances in life. So when somebody knows that if I do not go through this, there is an institute who will take me because maybe I'm not this good, but I'm good at something. So an accessible to education for female would be making more sense when it is catered to certain types of females, when it caters to people who actually need them. So rural versus urban education system are not the same. We do not get access. We take internet for granted, but I have seen during COVID how much teachers have suffered, even when they were expected to teach, they suddenly expected to become YouTubers, they suddenly expected to become tech savvy, whereas they simply cannot do that. How we expect to have a role model in this context when we ourselves are not equal in our own judgments? So yes, I stand true to my notion that accessible to education would be making more sense when we really think about who we are taking in.
Thank you, Professor Mamoon. Always insightful about the context in particular. Ms. Gonzalez, I appreciate your introduction very much. And if I could use this opportunity, instead of asking you about access, but use this opportunity to transition into a discussion about efficacy. So the thought here, the driver is, even if we're able to increase access to higher education for women, there's a belief that the existing higher education may not be as effective for women, for example, as it could be. And the idea, and I think these were your words, the idea that in many disciplines, perhaps, that it's been built by men for men. Tell us what you mean about this, and what it might mean for the way we think about the curriculum and the kinds of things and the ways that we teach in higher education.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a story or a good example to highlight this. Let me see if I can think of something as I speak. I think that, one of the things that we've seen is when there's a purposeful outreach, and I think that some of the speakers on the panel have alluded to that, when you're purposefully outreaching to those who may not have the access traditionally, or may not have been exposed to the opportunities, then you can provide new opportunities that would allow for some adjustment to make up for the biases and the discrimination that they might have experienced in the past. So one example of that would be, a program that's specifically targeting women, let's say, if you're thinking about STEM classes, science, mathematics, technology, where you don't normally have many women. If you have targeted programs for that, then you can help increase the chances of that access, and then also increase the chances of success, because you can do things like link them to the mentors that were mentioned by some of the other panelists, put them into these programs where you're teaching them the skills to be successful as they go on after higher education. So I think that there's definitely a place for these targeted programs. And what we found on CIPE side, and what I found in my own experience participating in targeted, women's leadership programs, is that it provides a space for, in that case, women to come together and find their shared commonalities and their shared challenges. And there's a lot of emotional release there, and there's a lot of strength and confidence that's gained by just hearing that you're not alone, and that there's other people who have this same experience, whether it's in the same city or whether it's across the world. And I think that's very powerful. And so thinking about how to make programming more effective, one way is to have these targeted spaces, these safe spaces where you can have these groups that have been discriminated against, who don't normally have the access, like Professor Sutton was saying, kind of reaching back down the long pipeline that we have. And, because it is a complex issue, like you were saying at one point, in terms of so many things are interconnected. And if you were talking at the level of higher education, well, yeah, there's the secondary and the primary and the preschooling, and, the first 3 years of life that happened before that. And so I think too, though, one final thought is that even with these, special programs or creating these safe spaces, you finish that and then you go back to the structure that exists, or you go back to the real world, or you go back to your company where, it's being led by men and there's not space for women, or whatever it is. you still face these structural institutions. And we just had an event in Kosovo this past week where we were talking about the challenges for women in politics and women in business together, specifically in the context of like online abuse. But they said that there's all sorts of abuse that happens. There's the psychological abuse, there's the emotional abuse, the economic abuse, and they mentioned, and there's another one, there's the neglect, the institutional abuse. And I think that was just another way to say this idea of institutions and structures and processes, and even like what we consider like a formal company, were mostly designed by men, and from a very male, traditional, hierarchical, patriarchal perspective. And so those institutions don't serve women. Those institutions don't serve groups that are marginalized. So how do we make those changes so that you can also structurally make these changes? And that's big. And I don't have answers, but I just thought it was interesting perspective how the participants in our event named it as a type of like abuse, is that like institutionally, we haven't built institutions that can provide the services that women or other minorities need.
Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. That was a very interesting segue into this discussion about efficacy. And Professor Frey, anything to say about that? But also, I'd love to hear your perspectives on the kinds of things we need to do, especially when we're talking about entrepreneurship education, that might be enable us to be more effective in an environment where we're really working harder for women to have access. Please.
Well, thank you for that. In terms of entrepreneurship, first of all, I mean, the very first step is for young girls and women to think of themselves as entrepreneurs. And this is a bit of a mind bender for some people, even after they reach my classroom, right, which is higher education in the US, pretty privileged situation. And even in those environments, you'll have people who have the voice inside their head. I can't, I'm not good enough. We all know probably some of the research that was made a bit more popular in LinkedIn, but it shows all things being equal, education, background, experience. A man is more likely to say, sure, I'll start my own business, versus a woman who says, I'm not sure, I don't know if I have enough skills. So that starts quite early. Differences in self-efficacy by gender start differing around age 11. And so it's getting the girls then, right? And showing them what is possible. I don't think it's that we have to fix everything in one broad motion. You've mentioned, and some of the other panelists have mentioned, there's some very large problems out there, but showing them what is possible. So one of the most interesting stories we've seen, because we've worked with girls and women from about 140 countries, is in the Middle East. And where we've seen women making some real progress and passing that along to their daughters, it gets back to one of the topics that was discussed earlier, male allyship. So when you really dig and say, here might be my role model, which we know is half of the self-efficacy equation and half of the belief, I can do this, right? Because you have to walk around with that brain every day, despite what programs are put in front of you, et cetera. That's really just the path. But that if they won't even take the step, then we're in trouble, which is why we focus a lot on self-efficacy and exposure to role models and showing them what is possible. And when we started digging in the cases of many women from the Middle East who had successfully endeavored in entrepreneurship, they said, I had a male ally. And they sort of cleared the path for me. And so it's really not just self-efficacy, but it's understanding culturally how to get things done and finding a role model who has done that. That's a very interesting and enlightening experience. And you know, in one country we're dealing with corruption and laws. Some of the other panelists have mentioned laws. In another, it's completely different in terms of, it might be the entrepreneurial culture. In the US, we like to say, how big can it be? You know, shocker. And in other countries, it may be, how can I benefit my community? Right? So sort of respecting some of those norms and working within them, but finding an appropriate role model who has, you know, made it through some of those barriers and bringing them to the future entrepreneurs you want to inspire has been incredibly powerful for us. And those safe spaces, boom, you've got a recipe for success. I mean, it's really incredible. It's I'm sure everybody has experienced that in some way, seeing what happens when you bring these young women who would like to become entrepreneurs together with people who have achieved change, even if it's just one person. It's very exciting and inspiring. And we've seen that actually work to get people to take that first step.
So that work that schools do or institutions do to help build that network or support building that network in a meaningful way, I think is especially important. Thanks for sharing that, Professor Frey. I want to go back to Dr. Agarwal. And I'm, of course, very interested in where you see the discussion evolving in light of your starting point with the evidence. But also in particular, when we had a conversation about the kinds of things related to efficacy, you pointed to assessments. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that with us to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Right, so there's been a lot of discussion about sort of structures and institutions made by men for men. And like, I want to just like sort of narrow down on one small thing, which is about assessment. And there's a very recent research which just came out a couple months ago, and that really sort of instigated like sparks in my head. And that finds that when you increase the multiple choice questions on an assessment, females tend to do worse. And these are math assessments. But when you have more open-ended questions where you can spend time, you have a bit more openness to like, okay, there are different ways to solve this problem, and you get partial credit for different approaches, then women tend to perform better. But if all of our sort of, let's say whether you get into a prestigious program or not, is based on these assessments that are essentially multiple choice questions, then that also sort of puts women on a back seat in some way. So I think that's not about, I won't call it about institution, but also the sort of sub-institution structure, how institutions work on a day-to-day basis. And this sort of differences in how different genders respond to assessment criteria. It's something that we might want to consider how even we want to structure our courses. So girls do tend to be a little bit more, when there is less time pressure and a bit more creativity, like can I be more creative instead of just skipping answers when you have in a tight time pressure. So that's something to consider about in terms of assessment. And I've started to think more and more about that. I mean, it does put a lot more grading pressure on me with a class of 150 students, but can I sort of make it 50-50 at least to begin with, to let others shine who may be constrained because of this MCQ system that we have in many universities. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. It's very interesting that, sometimes when we think about how effective a curriculum is, even though it's obvious, we don't always think about the assessment and the kinds of things that might be built into the assessments that either encourage or discourage learners. I want to ask Dr. Machares a little bit about STEM. As an opportunity for us to learn potentially in business, but not only that, I wonder about your experience more generally in this context.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, Dan. And in this sense, actually, in Mexico, unfortunately, women only attend, well, 38% of STEM careers are women taking them instead of 50-50 that probably we would expect. And in this sense, it is actually very important, and I want to refer also to what Professor Corman was saying in terms of having these role models, and this is the key, I would say, because in many cases, young women don't necessarily envision, they don't think that they can actually be part of this type of work, no? or even develop these capabilities. And so actually, with the university where I work at, we have been working a lot with women in data science. For example, this is something that we have created this connection in order to, yes, part of it has to do with these mentorship programs, but at the same time, to give some visibility to the women that are already working in these types of roles. And also early in the discussion, or I'm not sure if it was in the initial presentation, we were talking about having these cases, these case studies to actually in business schools provide these opportunities to reflect on what's happening and having these women in senior roles representing, being protagonists of the cases. So the young women also can actually see that there is a possibility to develop a career either as an entrepreneur or inside a company. I think Connie was mentioning something related to this, no? How can we present that? And one of the benefits that I see is it's a win-win for everybody. Actually, today we had a very interesting discussion in a session in executive education, in which I invited a former CEO, a woman who was the CEO of a logistics company, and the majority of the audience were men. There were some women as well, but it was very interesting for them to understand the perspective of this woman making some decisions for the business, but also personally. And then there is an opportunity to develop this complementarity between the men's way of thinking and their experience, but also what happens with women and what are the challenges that they are facing.
Thank you, Dr. Macharas. That was a great example about the kinds of things that we could think about across different disciplines and helping create new pathways, I think, career-wise, which is very important. I'm gonna, because I'm a little behind in moving to the throughout the discussion, I want to shift gears now, with apologies to Professor Mamoon for not getting to you about this question, but I'm going to point to Dr. Sutton and then to you, Professor Mamoon. I want to start us off in the discussion about impact, right? Because, the way I think about it, perhaps overly simplistic, is that, if we're able to improve access to education, to higher education, then you say, look, if we're able to do a better job of making education more inclusive, right, sort of decolonize education, great, right? But as many of you have already mentioned, the idea of sending people out into an environment, a workforce, organizations that are not different as a consequence of what's happening is I guess depressing, number one, but number two, what I'm interested in what can universities do to help change organizations, to help change society more generally. And I want to start with you, Dr. Sutton, because your background's accounting, right? I'm wondering, for example, in accounting, how do we make this more inclusive? How do we make this more embracing, even if we're succeed on those other dimensions?
Sure. I mean, in one sense, I think it's probably relevant to pick up on this construct that Connie gave us before about thinking around, institutional abuse, or what probably we might think about in terms of structural discrimination. So I think many organizations in accounting, in business and so on the face value are all up for inclusivity, really want representation of people from diverse backgrounds and diverse genders and identities at all levels of their organization. And yet we know that there are structural impediments that affect particularly the ability of different people to progress in organizations. And it comes back to the idea of whether or not organizations genuinely recognize the differences that individuals will have in terms of career interruptions or caring responsibilities, and the way in which they may accommodate that, both in terms of their day-to-day practices, so in terms of flexibility, in terms of working hours and places. And in one sense, it'll be interesting to see the effects of COVID and the great working from home migration, which for many people, men and women, being able to work remotely has greatly enhanced their ability to play a more active role in their children's lives day to day. And I'm hanging on to that. And I doubt we'll see return back to full-time working in the office anymore. But so there's those sorts of things in terms of being able to provide more flexible working arrangements that can accommodate people's caring responsibilities, not just with children, but we also know that people, particularly women, end up in what's called a sandwich generation because of the demographics right now, that they may be lumped at the same time with caring responsibilities for children at the same time as caring responsibilities for older parents as well. So recognizing this and actually having practice in place to accommodate that. The other thing in terms, I think, is where we want to see more genuine steps is how are organizations recognizing career interruptions when it comes to promotion decisions and performance evaluation? It's one thing to say, yes, of course we accommodate, and then not to take these sorts of things into account when it actually comes down to evaluating people's performance and then looking between different people and allowing different people to progress. And that to me is one of the kind of key things that organizations need to crack in order to provide genuinely inclusive environments that will actually enable women to progress beyond just entry level and lower level kind of elements of organizations, and be able to aspire and actually have representation in the more senior leadership roles.
Yeah, agreed. And, this role that universities can play in helping us to understand some of those challenges and to address them. And I want to now go to Professor Mamoon, and I want to ask, you talked about the role of a university in terms of alumni, for example, and the role that alumni can play in driving change. Could you explore that with us for a bit?
Yes, sure. So about this impact, what we have in institutions from school, colleges, and universities, with inclusion, we also have to add collaboration. Because you see that once I finish my studies, I need to know I have a degree. Then I would apply in a sea of applications, and I might get noticed, and then again something. So with an university's strong alumni networks, we can help these women get noticed. We can help these women to get being placed in their right positions. So financial literacy and financial independence is the key thing for any education to pull through. So I would know that I'm investing in this next 4 years of my life, because in the end, when I get to the finish line, there will be a return on this investment of time. So I would use this platform and space to come forward and say that business school needs to be also less snob and allow all the disciplines to think entrepreneurism as the key thing. So when we include entrepreneurship to not only catering to business school, rather every discipline can include entrepreneurship, and we can have a conclusive arrangement of entrepreneurism for any people who wants to be included. So giving the right space to sell product. When I know that I have a brilliant idea, I would stay silent because I do not know what to do with it. But if I know that my university, my alumni network has a space for me, that if I want to sell something, if I want to start a business, I will have some support. That is the right kind of impact we might be looking at.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mahmood. I appreciate hearing that. Sometimes we forget about this powerful network of alumni that we have and the kind of role they could play in this question. Dr. Macharas, quickly, informal economy, right? Informal employment. Sometimes we spend so much time thinking about formal jobs that we forget that in many parts of the world, the economy is largely informal, right? And people, up to 85% of the people are engaged in an informal economy. Tell us a little bit about how schools might think about their role vis-a-vis informal employment.
Well, I believe that one of the things that we are certainly called to do is, as we have also a broad, and as Professor Mamoon was saying, a broad network of different alumni already, or even in executive education, and we actually have programs for both groups. It is truly important to raise awareness regarding the importance of having more formal and flexible jobs. In the case of Mexico, 55% of women with paid labor work informally. And unfortunately, they don't have access to social security, for example, or a pension, or any kind of support when they are facing a health problem, for example. Or even during not only childbirth, but during pregnancy. So in this sense, I truly believe that we can influence even in our own networks, and of course through research, by doing this analysis of what is the impact of not having more flexibility in organizations and different types of companies, for not having enough infrastructure in the public policies, but at the same time also to promote entrepreneurship and having more security or more structure for these types of roles that are more independent, and women actually in many different stages throughout their careers opt to interrupt or change to do something more flexible for personal reasons.
No, thank you for that. Thinking about these different contexts differently, I think is very important. Dr. Agarwal, do parental leave policies work? Right, back to our evidence. This is something we exchanged a little bit on. Do they work?
Well, maybe not in the way we want them to. So let me start by giving like a short story. I mean, actually, this is a research done. So they picked up these MBA students at the University of Chicago, right, which is the top creamy-layered, really talented students, and they follow them like throughout their career. And what they find is at their first job, men and women make equal pay. There is no gender gap. But it's what you see is over time, more and more women start to switch towards motherhood or try and look for those flexible work opportunities that we have been talking about, but they don't find them. And that's what leads to this, what we call a gender wage gap. And that's where comes the role of your parental leave policies. Now, of course, they work, but there's also an unintended consequence of that, which is when the firm knows that this person, I have to pay her full salary, but she's not going to come to work for next 6 months, they are less likely to hire you. And that's where comes the role of a gender neutral parental leave policy. So letting couples decide which parent gets to hold on to the job for a while. And I mean, there are mixed results even for that, like even a gender neutral parental leave policy in the case of assistant professors finds that men get to be more productive even when they're staying home, whereas females tend to be a bit more emotionally sort of agitated when their kid is, let's say, crying. So they're less productive at home as compared to men. So even that has negative consequences, but we don't have to talk about all the negativity to end this, but it seems like a gender neutral parental leave policy seems to work better than a maternal leave policy, because a maternal leave policy sort of changes the incentive of the firm to hire the female in the first place. So yeah, that is where I would end, and I see it's 1 o'clock here. Yeah.
Thanks for keeping me on track with the time. In fact, we're going to close this with apologies to Ms. Gonzalez. We're not going to go back to you, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking Professor Frey. You've been here throughout this discussion. You've pointed to things in the chat. You've initiated discussion about the role of men, right, which we've continued throughout this discussion. I think even raised by Ms. Inarelli early in the discussion about how we think about these kinds of things sometimes might seem a little bit separate. I'm going to give you the opportunity to make some final remarks about the things that you've heard, if you're willing. And then I'm going to turn it back to Maddie to close the session. I have to say that I could go on, and actually Maddie said, look, if you need more time, don't worry about it, right? But I know it's getting late in some places, and I want to make sure that we close the event. So Professor Frey, any final remarks on behalf of everyone that's been participating so far?
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I've just been amazed and taking my own notes actually this entire time on what you all have been presenting. This is a think tank really that you've put together, and I just find this information incredibly helpful. I think one of the things that I really sensed a lot of, shall we say, coalescence or similar views around is this idea of the role model and the mentor, and introducing to girls at every level what is possible. Even recently in my class, we had somebody who is in a very interesting and tough industry, and my students commented on how inspirational this individual was, and it shows you the power of one, just what one person can do. And also what Dr. Mucharas was talking about, introducing the data scientist, right? We're creating multiplier effects just by introducing the power of one and what is possible into these populations. Entrepreneurship, I love how people keep coming back to that. Of course, you know, I'm a huge fan. And it's wound up being one of the reasons why women have had, of course, challenges, but some additional success in working around corporations in the US because of parallel institutionalism. So if they have the education, if they have the role models, they feel comfortable to start their own business. Even if it's a type of necessity entrepreneurship in their village, right? We have stories of women selling time on their cell phone in a rural area of Africa. You know, they're entrepreneurs. And so these examples are everywhere and very inspirational. And that to the extent that we can introduce those stories to young women around the world, I think they can begin to, with some assistance, chart their own path from there. And I think my dogs may also want to make some closing remarks, but I will mute myself.
Well, that's great. I love that. That's this emphasis on mentoring, this power of one point that you raised, Professor Frey. But I think I see a lot of nodding heads. In fact, when you think about the origins of this workshop, it was through the work that we're doing in Papua New Guinea to help schools think about the next steps in their entrepreneurship programs. And I think they've, I hope, picked up a lot from this discussion, not only for that, but for a variety of roles they could play in the communities that they serve. And I just want to stop by saying thank you to all of our panelists and our introductory remarks from Ms. Anarelli and Ms. Gonzalez in the beginning. And I'm going to turn it back over to Maddie to just close the event. And thanks everyone for participating.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. I'm just going to add myself here since I don't want to take away from this lovely panel, but thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you for our PNG schools who are in the same rooms. I see you're off camera now, but that's okay. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all of our visiting CIPE members. Thank you for all of our network members. We are so excited. As I had mentioned in some of my comments earlier, we will be providing a recording of this in the next coming days, and we are just so thankful for that. If you do have any additional questions or comments, you have my email address, and I believe that all of our panelists here are available on LinkedIn. So that is another great way to connect. But if you do have any more future questions or interest in what we're doing at GBSN and what we're doing at GBSN with CIPE, please do let me know. We're always open to new ideas, and we're always open to new context and topics. So at this time, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to everybody. And I wish you all just the best morning, the best afternoon, and the best evening, wherever you are in the world. So thank you so, so much. And we will talk really soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.